heads, as soon as they found a trail wide and smooth enough to run on, they ran. There was no stopping them until the trail became bad again, and then they stopped of themselves. Continuously for days they had performed the hardest kind of work and fed most of the time on grass foraged by themselves at night while we slept, and yet that day they covered 28 leg-breaking miles and galloped into Hana like a bunch of colts. Also, there were several of them reared in the dry region on the leeward side of Haleakala that had never worn shoes in all their lives. Day after day, and all day long, unshod, they had traveled over the sharp lava with the extra weight of a man on their backs, and their hoofs were in better condition than those of the shod horses. The scenery between Vieiras's, where the Kaupo Gap empties into the sea, and Lana, which we covered in half a day, is well worth a week or month. But, wildly beautiful as it is, it becomes pale and small in comparison with the wonderland that lies beyond the rubber plantations between Hana and the Honamanu Gulch. 2 days were required to cover this marvelous stretch, which lies on the windward side of Haleakala. The people who dwell there call it the Ditch Country, an unprepossessing name, but it has no other. Nobody else ever comes there. Nobody else knows anything about it. With the exception of a handful of men whom business has brought there, nobody has heard of the Ditch Country of Maui. Now a ditch is a ditch, assumably muddy, and usually traversing uninteresting and monotonous landscapes. But the Nahiku Ditch is not an ordinary ditch. The windward side of Haleakala is serried by 1,000 precipitous gorges, down which rush as many torrents, each torrent of which achieves a score of cascades and waterfalls before it reaches the sea. More rain comes down here than in any other region in the world. In 1904 the year's downpour was 420 inches. Water means sugar, and sugar is the backbone of the territory of Hawaii, wherefore the Nahiku Ditch, which is not a ditch but a chain of tunnels. The water travels underground, appearing only at intervals to leap a gorge, traveling high in the air on a giddy flume, and plunging into and through the opposing mountain. This magnificent waterway is called a ditch, and with equal appropriateness can Cleopatra's barge be called a box-car. There are no carriage roads through the ditch country, and before the ditch was built, or bored, rather, there was no horse trail. Hundreds of inches of rain annually on fertile soil under a tropic sun means a steaming jungle of vegetation. A man on foot, cutting his way through, might advance a mile a day. But at the end of a week he would be a wreck, and he would have to crawl hastily back if he wanted to get out before the vegetation overran the passageway he had cut. O'Shaughnessy was the daring engineer who conquered the jungle and the gorges, ran the ditch, and made the horse trail. He built enduringly, in concrete and masonry, and made one of the most remarkable water farms in the world. Every little runlet and dribble is harvested and conveyed by subterranean channels to the main ditch. But so heavily does it rain at times that countless spillways let the surplus escape to the sea. The horse trail is not very wide. Like the engineer who built it, it dares anything. Where the ditch plunges through the mountain, it climbs over, and where the ditch leaps a gorge on a flume, the horse trail takes advantage of the ditch and crosses on top of the flume. That careless trail thinks nothing of traveling up or down the faces of precipices. It gouges its narrow way out of the wall, dodging around waterfalls or passing under them, where they thunder down in white fury. While straight overhead the wall rises hundreds of feet, and straight beneath it sinks 1,000. And those marvelous mountain horses are as unconcerned as the trail. They fox-trot along it as a matter of course, though the footing is slippery with rain, and they will gallop with their hind feet slipping over the edge if you let them. I advise only those with steady nerves and cool heads to tackle the Nahiku Ditch trail. One of our cowboys was noted as the strongest and bravest on the big ranch. He had ridden mountain horses all his life on the rugged western slopes of Haleakala. He was first in the horse breaking, and when the others hung back as a matter of course, he would go in to meet a wild bull in the cattle pen. He had a reputation. But he had never ridden over the Nahiku Ditch. It was there he lost his reputation. When he faced the first flume, spanning a hair-raising gorge, narrow, without railings, with a bellowing waterfall above, another below, and directly beneath a wild cascade, the air filled with driving spray and rocking to the clamor and rush of sound and motion, Well, that cowboy dismounted from his horse, explained briefly that he had a wife and 2 children, and crossed over on foot, leading the horse behind him. The only relief from the flumes was the precipices, and the only relief from the precipices was the flumes, except where the ditch was far underground, in which case we crossed one horse and rider at a time, on primitive log bridges that swayed and teetered and threatened to carry away. I confess that at first I rode such places with my feet loose in the stirrups, and that on the sheer walls I saw to it, by a definite, conscious act of will, that the foot in the outside stirrup, overhanging the 1,000 feet of fall, was exceedingly loose. I say at first, for as in the crater itself we quickly lost our conception of magnitude, so on the Nahiku Ditch we quickly lost our apprehension of depth. The ceaseless iteration of height and depth produced a state of consciousness in which height and depth were accepted as the ordinary conditions of existence, and from the horse's back to look sheer down 400 or 500 feet became quite commonplace and non-productive of thrills. And as carelessly as the trail and the horses, we swung along the dizzy heights and ducked around or through the waterfalls. And such a ride! Falling water was everywhere. We rode above the clouds, under the clouds, and through the clouds, and every now and then a shaft of sunshine penetrated like a searchlight to the depths yawning beneath us, or flashed upon some pinnacle of the crater rim thousands of feet above. At every turn of the trail a waterfall or a dozen waterfalls, leaping hundreds of feet through the air, burst upon our vision. At our first night's camp in the Keanaa Gulch we counted 32 waterfalls from a single viewpoint. The vegetation ran riot over that wild land. There were forests of koa and kolea trees and candlenut trees, and then there were the trees called ohia ai, which bore red mountain apples, mellow and juicy and most excellent to eat. Wild bananas grew everywhere, clinging to the sides of the gorges, and overborne by their great bunches of ripe fruit, falling across the trail and blocking the way. And over the forest surged a sea of green life, the climbers of 1,000 varieties, some that floated airily, in lace-like filaments, from the tallest branches, others that coiled and wound about the trees like huge serpents, and one, the eeee, that was for all the world like a climbing palm, swinging on a thick stem from branch to branch and tree to tree, and throttling the supports whereby it climbed. Through the sea of green, lofty tree ferns thrust their great delicate fronds, and the lehua flaunted its scarlet blossoms. Underneath the climbers, in no less profusion, grew the warm-colored, strangely marked plants that in the United States one is accustomed to seeing preciously conserved in hothouses. In fact, the ditch country of Maui is nothing more nor less than a huge conservatory. Every familiar variety of fern flourishes, and more varieties that are unfamiliar, from the tiniest maidenhair to the gross and voracious staghorn, the latter the terror of the woodsman, interlacing with itself in tangled masses 5 or 6 feet deep and covering acres. Never was there such a ride. For 2 days it lasted, when we emerged into rolling country and along an actual wagon road came home to the ranch at a gallop. I know it was cruel to gallop the horses after such a long, hard journey, but we blistered our hands in vain effort to hold them in. That's the sort of horses they grow on Haleakala. At the ranch there was great festival of cattle driving, branding, and horse breaking. Overhead, Ukiukiu and Naulu battled valiantly, and far above, in the sunshine, towered the mighty summit of Haleakala. End of Chapter 8. Recorded by Brian Ness. This recording is in the public domain.